with MSD UK. And of course, he'll talk about a little bit about that as well. And in his bio that I have here, it says he's also been the chairman of the Supplier Diversity Council in the UK, and whether that's different or separate to MSD UK, and regularly speaks on all sorts of topics, including things like this one, the advanced negotiation techniques, and also generally about being able to work with a range of businesses across the globe. So David, I think that's probably enough bigging you up.
Thank you.
And I'm going to hand over to you now. I'll be managing the chat and letting people access. And thanks, David.
Okay. Do you want to run through these housekeeping notes?
Of course
Barbara?
I do. Totally forgot. Totally forgot. Thank you for that, David. Yes, as I was saying, as you come into the meeting, all participants will be muted, and I'm just letting somebody else in now. Sorry for the distraction. So I'm not sure that there is a put your hand up facility, but I'll be watching the chat. So if you have any questions, please put your questions in there. We will be giving you the opportunity to unmute later, so you'll be able to speak and respond. But at this point, we're keeping it on mute. Do join in, do engage. It's going to make everybody else's experience better. Also, we're going to be recording this, and the only place we're going to share it is with our extended network, and a little bit of it on social media as well. So if there is any shyness or you don't want to be heard or seen on camera, please bear that in mind and perhaps take yourself off camera and be on mute. But I have pressed record on this. So that's that slide in terms of housekeeping. Anything
Okay.
else? And straight over to you then, David.
Wonderful. Seamless stuff, Barbara. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this negotiation workshop. I saw from the attendee list, there's a few of you who've been here before and seen some of the materials that we're going to show today, as well as have been through some of the training. So if that is the case, what I'm hoping is that you can find some extra dimensions in the materials today, and that it'll help not only refresh you and refresh your memory from those sessions, but also, like I say, give you that extra level of understanding of how we think about negotiation. Normally, if we were together, this would be a hugely interactive session. I'm not really a fan of too much PowerPoint, but the world is in a strange place. So we'll be as interactive as we can be. Hopefully the technology won't let us down. What's more likely to let us down is my complete ineptitude with technology. So I'll do my best to kind of manage that with Barbara's help. But use the chat function if you have questions, and we'll try and make sure we can address any of those as we go through. Or if there's anything that isn't clear or you'd like us to spend more time on, again, if you use chat as the primary routes to get to me or to Barbara, then that's probably the most sensible way to do it. Worst case, unmute yourself and ask directly, and hopefully we can make that work. So a little bit about myself. I won't spend too much on this. So as Barbara said, I used to be chairman of MSD UK, and I did that when I was head of procurement for Merck. I've held roles in procurement for Merck and for GlaxoSmithKline, as well as in business development for organizations like DHL and Anglo American. So a reasonably solid background in big corporate work, particularly on thinking about how big corporates work with their suppliers and manage supply chains. And from all that, what I continue to identify is just what some of those genuine challenges are for those organizations, and how they struggle with the balance of a desire to work with more diverse organizations, and then the internal constraints that make that difficult for them to engage. And we can talk about that a little bit later. And then what I also have experienced and observed is really a lot of how negotiations fail. And one of the reasons negotiations fail is because we approach them with a completely incorrect mindset. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today is how we change our mindset when we think about our engagement and when we think about negotiating. And if we can get ourselves into that different place, that different mindset, we can actually generate a lot more value. So we'll talk about some of those principles as we go through today. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. So we are in difficult times. I am obviously locked down at home. I have 3 children running around somewhere, 2 dogs, and my wife will probably come in and ask me to take the bins out again. So hopefully we will be not too distracted, but recognize that we're all in this difficult place, and let's all do our best to manage against that. So just a little bit about the organization I work for. So I work with a bunch of consultants who are in a company called Vantage Partners. They're based out of Boston in the US. And that's important only for one reason, and that's because the founders of Vantage Partners were also founders of a piece of work at Harvard University in the States called the Harvard Negotiation Project. So what we're going to be talking about today is really the commercialization of some academic work that was done at Harvard about 20 to 25 years ago to really look at negotiations in depth and really try and understand what the key aspects of negotiation are and how, if you use them in the right way, you can generate positive outcomes from your engagements with either suppliers or customers or alliance partners, or even, you know, in your personal life. So Vantage Partners really began that work at Harvard with a view to looking at it in terms of international conflict. So Harvard was tasked in part by the US government to do some academia to say, well, why is it that countries end up firing bullets and throwing bombs at each other as a way to resolve differences? And from that distilled a whole load of thinking and academic work that started to really challenge why it is we get to those extreme situations of disagreement. And by unbundling and unpicking those areas of disagreement, what you then actually find is that there are ways to engage with things differently, that recognize difference, that recognize that 2 parties will have a different opinion or a different approach or a different way of thinking, but they can still come to mutually beneficial outcomes. So some of that academia then went on and was used in Truth and Reconciliation, post-apartheid South Africa. Some of it was used in some of the early Middle East discussions like Camp David, and some of it was used in the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland. So it genuinely is applied across the international diplomacy region. In fact, I have a colleague who still works at Vantage who helped some of the negotiations when North and South Sudan split and were in civil war. So it really does get used in some quite serious and some quite significant international conflict areas. But today we're going to focus on it in terms of how it's commercialized and how the thinking applies to organizations that are trying to work with each other. Okay, right. So again, just some purposes today. So we're going to think about, value propositions and think about how negotiation helps us in terms of how do we identify that we've got value to offer, and at what point are we talking about the value we have to offer with the customers and the companies that we want to work with. We obviously want to think about how we improve our ability to negotiate well and to be assertive and to be strong in our negotiations. Thinking about, again, this change in mindset, this way to change the game when we're planning and executing negotiation strategy. And then we'll talk a little bit about some difficult challenges. How do we deal with difficult situations in negotiations? How do we avoid, banging our head against a brick wall? And how do we avoid haggling? So we'll talk a little bit about that as well as we go through. What I want to do now is really kind of test the technology to see if it works. So really what I'm going to do is mute myself and drink some coffee for a minute or two and just ask you to think about your biggest negotiation challenges. All right. So what's hard for you when you're negotiating? Have a think about what those things are. And then what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe to drop a note into the chat, and hopefully we can pick up those and maybe talk a little bit about some of those challenges. And then what we'll do throughout the webinar is refer to those challenges as well as some of the others that come up as we go through the material, with a view that says, I want the materials today to be totally relevant to what's important to you, not a bunch of academic slides. So try and do that. Put a couple of notes in the chat. I will try and call on you then to unmute and maybe talk to the group about it, if we can get that to work in anything like an orderly manner. So over to you. I feel like this bit should have some background music, perhaps.
I'll think about the background music for next time, Dave. I'll bring something along with me, probably to everybody's taste. I'm not seeing anything coming up in the chat.
Oh, I'm seeing stuff, so that's incredibly good.
Barbara, sorry, I sent mine to David directly.
No problem. That's absolutely fine. That's fine.
Yeah. Thank you. This is amazing that this is working. So technology and me are not best friends. I still have a Betamax video recorder somewhere, and guess what? The clock doesn't work on it. A lot of young people going, what the hell is a Betamax video recorder? I also have a Cocker Spaniel, so if you can hear him barking, I do apologize. Okay, so we've got a few here. I'm going to share them, and if I can be clever and get a few folks to talk about them, let's try and do that. So Nish, you know, this will teach you to put it straight up there first. So what I've got from you is, what is the right price? Some guesswork based on size of client. Recently we took I think you're saying you were taking too much of a lower price on a project. Could you unmute and just talk about that challenge, Nish? Would you mind?
Yeah, can do. I'm hoping this is something that a lot of people come across. So we were asked to put in a proposal and a price for one of the corporate members on the network. It's not somebody we worked with. Oddly enough, I've got a call with them at 11:30 today. So
excellent.
We haven't completely blown it, but we were asked to work on a global presentation project, and we priced it on what we thought was what we should charge, because it's based on the kind of amount of hours, etc., plus a little bit extra because of who they were. And they came back and said, this seems very cheap.
Okay.
But for us, we thought that's a fair price. So it's kind of like, are we trying to, what is the formula? Is there a formula? Thinking, right, so you're, I don't know, let's make someone up. Let's say you're GSK, so you've got an X amount of, you know, you've got this deep a pocket. So do you then end up thinking, right, because it's GSK, do you price it a little bit more to look like you're in the right ballpark, or do you price yourself out because you're a whippersnapper trying to get onto the ladder, or do you end up like we were, was like, we can't take it this. They didn't say we can't take this seriously, but that's what I'm reading between the lines, that the incumbent would charge a couple of zeros more than you were. Yeah, like, it wasn't a couple of zeros; they would have an extra zero on the end of it.
Yeah. So we'll come to some of this in an area called legitimacy later on. So when we talk about legitimacy, I think it's really relevant here. However, just kind of anecdotally understanding and talking through this, you've really got to, when it comes to price and proposals, you've got to put something that's totally and 110% defensible by you. So it is fair, it is equitable, it works for me as well as for the client. And if it doesn't work for you, don't ever do it. You know, buying business and all that kind of stuff, there's strategies in there that may or may not be useful, but a good buyer will normally spot that. So what you need to be able to do when you're talking about that is know that I've got a price that works for me. It gives me the return that I will need on this business so I can sustain and deliver what I promise. And then it has legitimacy, which again, we'll talk about a little bit later, that says, and here's how I demonstrate to that client why it's the right price for this business. Rather than actually spend my time arguing over the price, here's how I defend it with facts and data that says this is why it's appropriate. And I guess the buyer at GSK, for example, or somewhere like that, would be concerned at going too low. And one of the reasons for that would be they might think you're buying the business, and therefore in 6 months' time, you'll come back and you'll say, you know, that price, well, it kind of needs to go up a bit. And so they might have those concerns. But equally, and we'll talk about this in the procurement bit towards the end of the presentation, they will be thinking about personal risk and credibility as well as corporate risk and credibility. So they might be worried that if it looks too cheap, you know, you get what you pay for and all those types of things, that perhaps you can't deliver the service that they require against that, that price. So your job is to demonstrate very clearly that you can. Does that help?
It does. I think the issue that we have that other people might also have is our hourly rate based on our cost to exist is lower than an agency with 120 people based in central London.
Yep.
So we costed it based on what we would cost, you know, a client of ours like Grant Thornton International. We would work with them at X £100 a day plus this much for an idea. So we thought, right, we'll base it on that. Which is a different rate we would use for, say, on any work that we do for MSD UK. We charge Mank at a different rate. But for other clients, we would charge at a higher rate because they are a premium commercial client. So we used a methodology that I could back it up with, because I thought, you know, if they come back and say, can you expand on this, or can we up the scale from 5 projects to 20 projects or 22 projects, I could actually work through the methodology and work out. But there's someone's just written outcomes. But the issue with some projects is that you can't work out what revenue could be possibly generated. So it's a harder conversation to have. On projects we worked for clients before, where we would think, all right, the expectation is that it's a £500,000 potential return on investment. Is easier to justify a cost and say, you know, we're only charging you X% of a possible outcome.
So again, we'll come to some of that in legitimacy, and I really do think it's about, so everything you just said to me legitimizes why your price is what it is, right? And none of it unfair or unreasonable. And what you need to be able to do is put yourself in a position where you can clearly demonstrate why it's the appropriate price. And sometimes there are facts that are obvious, like I'm not paying for a central London office like some of my competitors, right? That's actually quite good and useful information. And some of it's other, you know, we have a different business mix where we have different client portfolios. That means some are at these rates, some are lower, some are higher. This is how we think about our business approach to pricing policy. That's all legitimacy. The real trick is to be able to defend it in a way that's believable from the client perspective. And it's all an area that we'll talk about later that we call legitimacy. Mrinal, I've got a note from you. As a fairly new business, charging the right price, having confidence to target larger clients, say no to smaller ones. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Are we on a similar theme here, or is it slightly different?
It is a fairly similar theme that, like Nish was saying, as somebody with a slightly new business, we could spend a lot of time and not do any work for our smaller clients to chase some of the big fish, and that would cost a lot of money. And I've worked with some of those guys before, and they've got long payment terms, and there's various challenges there. It is perhaps somewhere we want to get to, but it's a case of when. So but then if we're spending our time on the smaller ones, we have less resources to work on the bigger ones. And I think this is probably a common problem across a lot of smaller businesses.
I think it very much is, and it goes a lot broader than just, say, for example, negotiation strategy. It really talks to where can you compete, where can you win, and where can you optimize the time it takes to win to build your business, and then at what point can you then take steps into medium to larger size organizations. And typically, though, and I'm not going to teach you to suck eggs. I suspect you know this far more than me. Typically, those things only get easier when you've got a portfolio of references and credibility that you can rely on.
Yeah. Okay.
Prav, I've got. How do you negotiate on unit prices when you don't have much details on or info on the product? Do you want to talk a little bit about that one?
Hi, yes. So I've just started to get into the field of working with medical devices. Okay. So I'm still building my knowledge on each device and obviously what they do. Now, my question is when I'm approached by a customer or a client and they're quite persistent with negotiating on the unit price, how do I tackle negotiating on unit price when I don't have that much information yet on the medical device and they don't seem to give me the time to sort of look into the product so I can gauge the price to give? How do I sort of navigate around the negotiation so I'm not giving a price out?
Yeah, so one of the things we want to talk about today will be around, firstly, concepts like haggling and getting what we call positional bargaining, which is getting very caught up on price very early on in a negotiation. And once you get caught up in a price positional bargaining activity, it spirals and it spirals downwards typically, and it doesn't spiral upwards, right? We're going to talk about this in the first part of the negotiation discussion.
Oh, that's great.
So hopefully that'll be useful. But I do think one of the things that whenever you're engaging with a client or potential client is the ability to inquire and ask questions early on, I think is super important. And
okay, perfect. That's great.
I think it's very helpful to have a mindset that says, I'm not going to go in with all the answers because I simply don't have them. So I need to ask some questions, and I don't want to interrogate them. That's not good, right? But I want to develop a communication style that starts to get underneath what's important to them and what it is they're looking for, so I can be much better prepared in what I offer them.
Okay, perfect. That's great. Thank you. That helps a lot.
We'll touch on a few of those things, and if you attend one of the later workshops that we're planning, we're going to go into more detail about some elements of communication and some things around personalities and behaviors and the whole behavioral science approach to how you understand much better the person or the people that you're negotiating with.
Oh, brilliant. That's great. Thank you. I appreciate that.
No problem. Barbara says she knows what a Betamax video recorder is, so I'm glad I'm not the only one. I'm going to choose one more, and then apologies if I don't choose you. But again, let's keep moving through, and by all means keep sending me notes as you can. So I'll go down. I've got Shiraz saying a challenge we face is to get the customer to understand the value of service, not just the price. If you can, would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Hi. Yes.
Hi, sir.
Yeah, it's getting that value across. A lot of, well, not a lot of, but many businesses, they are just stuck on price.
Yeah.
So it doesn't really matter how much value your service can add to the business. And then secondly, sometimes the person that you're negotiating with isn't always the person that's going to benefit from the value. So, in our sector of transport, you could be dealing with the procurement manager or the purchasing manager, but the person that's going to benefit from all the value are the guys that are sitting in the logistics or the dispatch department.
Yeah.
getting that across and getting that through and getting them to understand that, I find is tough and challenging.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. And what we find, obviously, with organizations where they have a procurement organization, as well as the people who then use the products and services that you guys are selling, you've always got a disconnect there, right? And we're going to talk a lot about this later on. Procurement have a certain set of objectives that aren't always as aligned as one would like them to be to what the actual business is looking for. And they're also set goals and targets that aren't necessarily aligned to what the business is interested in either. For example, savings, right? And if you've got a target of savings, and I lived this world for 20 years, guess what? I can look at the best RFP response in the world, but I'll turn to the back page first and look at the number, right? It's a behavior. So what we need to do is think about how we navigate those stakeholders slightly differently. And again, in a later workshop, we'll talk about stakeholder management in terms of how do we get closer to the decision makers, and how do we make sure that when we're talking about value, that we're actually getting that message across to people who recognize and actually appreciate and want the value, not just the price. And that can be quite a challenging activity to do. It's not none of this is easy, by the way. If it was easy, none of you would be wasting time on this call. It's incredibly difficult, and in bigger organizations it just gets more complex, but there are ways that you can actually direct yourself and navigate yourself through to different stakeholders who will recognize what value is. So I'll give you an example on that, a really extreme example. I'm managing a whole series of negotiations for a pharmaceutical client at the moment for a very complex cancer treatment. And the complex cancer treatment costs $300,000 a patient, right? So it's not cheap. And you can imagine right now in a COVID-19 world and in a European environment that's had austerity for the last 10 years, there's not a government in the world that wants to talk about $300,000 per patient. However, there are patients and patient groups and doctors and clinicians who think the medical technology and the extra years of life that it brings is hugely valuable at that kind of price. So the more you can engage them in the overall negotiation, the more success you actually deliver, because you talk to people who recognize value, not just money. And of course, you've got to talk about both. You can't ignore one and talk about the other. But you can actually build much more momentum in your negotiation if you can reach that broader population.
Yeah, because I think many people also miss the fact that you could drive productivity efficiencies, and productivity improvements, which some people are just cost. So they want a number attached to it and don't really pay attention to the hours or days or. So
I suspect what they are, and again, we can pick this up in some of the legitimacy discussions. I suspect they're price focused, not cost focused. And what, again, you need to be able to think about is, what does total cost to serve look like? What does total cost look like to them, not just price? And price, as we know, is just one element of total cost. So again, that takes a different turn of the handle with a different set of legitimacies to start to talk about, here's the cost of this versus here's the price of this. And here's how we articulate that cost of this into the value that it will generate.
Thank you.
No problem. And there's a lot on here, guys. I'm sorry I can't get to all of them. So we'll try and keep talking through some of these challenges as we go through the material. I don't want to shortchange you on some of the sort of learning element of this as well, if that's okay. So we'll move on. So first thing I wanted to do was really think about how do we negotiate right now? And one of the things that we identify always is that we give ourselves a false choice. So we often enter negotiations under some preconceptions, and a lot of those preconceptions are actually false. So we see it as this sort of hard, soft challenge. We see it as either thinking we've got to be, for example, if we're thinking about the people we're negotiating with, we've got to be friendly, we've got to be nice, we've got to be all of those things, because that will get us to an agreement. Or we think the other way and we think that actually we've got to be tough and we've got to be resolute and we've got to bang the table and we've got to be like Donald Trump talking to the North Koreans, right? So we give ourselves these hard and soft dilemmas all the time. And what we want to do is challenge some of those approaches as we go through the material today, but actually just ask the first question of you when you're preparing for your negotiations, and preparation is the most important bit of any negotiation, is to really think about your approach and think about how you're going to show up, whether that's virtual, whether that's through an email response, whatever it is. How are you going to show up, and how do you make sure that you're outcomes focused, that you maintain a mantra that says, I'm going to be hard on the problem, but I'm going to be soft on the people. So this isn't an interpersonal issue. This is about people trying to find solutions, and those solutions are difficult. So I'm going to have to really think hard and be tough on finding those solutions. But I'm not going to get caught up in worrying, for example, that, gosh, if this person doesn't like me, if we don't go and have dinner or whatever it is, that somehow that's going to impact my ability to do a good deal. Equally, I don't want to make concessions to make sure that I get a deal. So I don't want to give anything just to keep a good relationship, because, and what we see with a lot of our clients, particularly the sales organizations, is that they give and they give and they give and they give because they're buying relationship. And ultimately they give to a point where the relationship is very amicable, but the business value has dropped so much that it's in some cases genuinely not worth them doing deals together. So we have a very large client, one of the big professional services companies, big consulting group based out of France. And their salespeople are given must-win target goals, right? Which says, here's a bunch of companies, you've got to go win them all. And so, of course, they're already handcuffed before they walk in the room. And what they do is they give and they give and they give and they concede to build these great relationships. And they have tremendously long relationships with some of these clients. But the business value is very, very small, much smaller than it should be for the type of work they're doing. So we help them kind of rethink and repeg those types of relationships. So we really want to start thinking about how we show up and what kind of relationship and engagement we need with potential clients, and not get caught up in some of the traps that mean we have to be overtly friendly, or we're worried about the kind of personalities of the relationship rather than the actual substance. We'll pick this theme up as we go through. But what we also see is that negotiation actually very rarely happens. What happens is bargaining. And so what we see developing in most negotiations, and I think this might look familiar to you, is stuff like this, right? So one side will start with, hey, here's that thing you wanted and it's a reasonable price. And the other side will go, okay, but I think it should be this. And you've suddenly started with two opposing positions. Okay. And you know how the game's played then, right? So the language changes and it might go, well, okay, just for you, I'll bring that price down a little bit. And the other side will go, well, okay, that's interesting. Maybe we can do something too. And so the conversation goes on with language like, that's my bottom line, or here's a final offer, or someone might threaten at this point, and then they might counter threat, and then you get take it or leave it type of language, or that's my final offer, that's all I can do, or I'm walking out, I'm gonna leave, this isn't good enough. And you might walk away and get no deal, or you might split the difference and compromise. We see that materializing in probably 90% of the negotiations we get involved in. And what I'll say to you is that isn't a negotiation, that's haggling, that's bargaining. But what I'll also say to you, it's probably the most familiar way of doing deals in the world, right? Virtually everything is done like this, unless you're prepared to go and try and change it. And the reasons you need to change it are this. When you look at these extreme positions, like a reasonable price of, or an extreme opening position, this is the start of a negotiation, typically on price, of course. And think about it. What is that? What would you normally put in there, right? And what you'd normally put in there is something that's actually either fictitious or artificially inflated. So what it means is your negotiation, if you can call it that, is actually starting from a point of deceit, right? And it's starting from a point of deceit because you both know how the game is played. So as we said in one of the opening slides, one of our goals is to change the game. It's because we don't want you to get caught up in some haggling based on prices and numbers that are kind of made up just because you've got to go through this little game of haggling and reducing your price and coming down to something and then splitting the difference. The second thing to say about this is I don't like compromise, and nothing in what we're going to talk to you about today is about making concessions or compromising. So I want that to be clear. And when we say be tough on the problem and soft on the people, it's because I want you not to have to compromise when you're negotiating. And all this is compromising. And when you split the difference, just to give you an example, so one of the pharmaceutical companies I was working with had a new HIV drug, and we were trying to negotiate it with the German government. The German government's opening position of what they were prepared to pay for that drug was, I think, about 240 euros a patient. The pharmaceuticals opening position was 750 euros a patient, right? So that's your two extreme positions. Now, if they'd split the difference, that would have been, my maths isn't great, the maths would have been about 350, right? Well, if your goal was genuinely to get a price of 250, well, you've missed that goal significantly. You've failed in your negotiation, Mr. Government Man. But if you're the pharma guy and your goal was 750 and you get 350, you've also failed, right? So a split the difference compromise actually can represent failure of both parties in the negotiation. And again, one of the big mindset changes that I want you to think about is we want both parties leaving the table knowing that they've got a great deal for themselves. So I really want to, the first message here is guard against getting caught up in bargaining. And this is always positional. It's never about value. It's always about a number. And normally the number it's about is price. So don't get into price too soon. And certainly don't get into price negotiations that look like this. So to the earlier question where we were talking about what an appropriate price looks like, what we need to do is to price our services and our goods with a lot of legitimacy and fairness and transparency such that we don't have to do this to get to the final answer. And the challenge you have and why this isn't easy is every procurement person on the planet is trained to behave like this, right? So when I first joined SmithKline Beecham, my boss said, here's what you do when that supplier comes in. And I used to buy a lot of transport and logistics services for SmithKline in those days. He said, that supplier comes in, whatever price they put on the table, you just keep saying no. And if you keep saying no, they're going to keep bringing that price down. And that's what I used to do. That's what I used to think good was, right? And the reason the supplier could bring the price down was in part because the price they'd started with was made up. And it was made up because they knew I would sit there and say no. The whole thing is a bit of a charade. So we really want to be more productive than that. And we want to be smarter than that. And that's really what we're going to start to talk about now. Okay, he said. There we go. Right. So this is one of the challenges, right? Is that we think success looks like our success means someone else's failure. All right. And negotiations, unfortunately, are still quite toxically masculine, testosterone fueled engagement where people think it's about winning and they think winning is about someone else losing. And again, what we want to do is change that mindset and say that actually a successful negotiation is both parties leaving the table with a good deal that they are confident in, they can execute against, and that delivers against the goals that are important to them. A deal that works for you but not for your counterparty is destined to fail at some point. So we need to change that mindset that says my victory equals your failure. Let me just build, oh, hang on, sorry. Let me just build this one up as well. We talked to this a little bit earlier, sorry. There we go. and this is one of the negotiators' dilemmas that we talk about, is this balance between substance and relationship. Okay, so what we often do is we look at either the substance of the deal, what do we get out of it, or we look at the relationship, and we give and take on both of those things. But what we want to make sure is that we get that tension in the right place, right? So if we give too much substance away to build or maintain a relationship, ultimately the deal doesn't have the value in it that we need. So it doesn't matter how good the relationship is because the business value isn't significant enough. Equally, if we go all out for substance and we risk ruining the relationship, our chances of future business, our chances of extending our business portfolio with a particular client are somewhat limited. So we're constantly in this sort of pendulum of thinking about how do we balance the substance and the business value we get from a deal with the efforts and the work we have to put in to maintain the relationship in the appropriate way. And most times we go too far one or too far the other. So aggressive buyers, for example, go substance, right? They don't like words like partnership. They push back on anything that looks overtly amicable. They think they have to go substance, right? Which is why we don't like dealing with them. Let's be honest, there's very few of you are going to put your hand up and say, yeah, those procurement people, gosh, they're a bundle of laughs. Most of you are probably going to say that they are tough on things like price. They're all about substance. Equally, salespeople and account management people often go too far to relationship because they think if we're friends, if we get on well, if we have dinner and we play golf and all of those good things, hey, I'm going to get more business out of it. Well, maybe, but oftentimes not. Oftentimes the concessions that you make mean that whatever business you're getting isn't as valuable as it could be. So, so that's one of the dilemmas we want to think about. I'm just going to call up a couple of chats. I'm aware that I'm talking hugely here, and I wanted to try and engage a little bit more. I've got a comment here from Michelle about walking out of a negotiation. Michelle, if you can hear, do you want to just talk about that a little bit?
Sorry, yes, I think you actually answered the question. So okay. Pretty much after. So basically, from what you said in the previous slide, it prompted me to say, well, are you saying that if a deal isn't right for you, or if you think that you don't add enough value and it doesn't match the price the client wants, whether it's worth even going ahead with the deal? Because I mean, yeah. To be honest, I'm sure like everyone else, we've walked away from deals that just won't work. So I'm saying, do you advocate that?
I do, absolutely. And when you look at one of the slides that closes out the negotiation piece we're about to go into, the actual starting phrase is no deal unless, right? So I'm all about there is no deal unless you can meet certain criteria. So it sounds a bit negative, because I guess it is, but actually it's about saying there isn't anything here for us to negotiate unless it meets these certain things. Whereas what most people would do is say, hey, there's a deal to be had here, so I need to do these things. It's like, well, actually, you've got to look at it the other way around, I think. Okay. And we'll also talk about an element in negotiation called alternatives. And walking away is in our language, is exercising your alternative. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's a great point because most of us are too scared to walk away when we should walk away. And most of us threaten to walk away when we don't mean that we're going to walk away. And actually that can risk making us look a little bit silly. So there's quite a lot of importance to attach to that, which I think we'll come to a little later.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the 7-element framework. So as I said at the start, the academic work that was done in Harvard 20 or so years ago really focused on, again, the negative side of agreements and actually thinking about why do they fail? Why is it that negotiations and agreements fail? And it came out with the findings that there were 7 elements that are present in every single agreement. And the ones that fail because the elements aren't being used or looked after or understood in the right way. So conversely, therefore, for agreements to succeed, managing these 7 elements in the appropriate way should drive to success factors. And that's obviously what's been observed over the last sort of 20 or so years of them working with this framework in various different scenarios. So again, in context, I use this framework in just about every engagement I ever have. Not always all of it. Sometimes it's a focus on a specific element. Sometimes it might be helping a client think through a negotiation they're already in the middle of, so we've got to course correct. Sometimes it's a blank sheet of paper where we can start from the very earliest preparation stages. But it is present in everything you do. You just don't yet know that. And once you do, what I need you to think about is, so how do I now do something differently now that I can recognize the elements that are at play? So I can be pretty sure that there's nothing I'm about to show you that you don't already experience or get involved in. What I want to do is show us how we actually use those elements in a much more productive, outcomes-focused way. And I think as we go through them, you'll kind of understand what I mean. It's a little bit like sitting at a chessboard with all the pieces. And you know that that one's a knight and that one's a castle, but you just don't quite know what they do yet, right? And once you do, of course, that improves your ability to play so much more. And so these are they. So these are the elements that we're going to talk through in a defined framework. So they are interests, alternatives, options, legitimacy, commitments, relationship, and communication. So I'm going to take you through all of those and how we use those. So imagine those as, if you will, your pieces on your chessboard right now. Okay, so those are the 7 pieces that you've got. And what we want to think about is how do we use those? Not just actually when you're executing and you're in the room or on the phone or on the video negotiating, but actually as you're preparing. And if you think a lot about these when you're preparing, it's invaluable by the time you get to execution, because like most things in life, the more you can focus on preparation, the better you will be in execution. So if you do nothing else but use these in your preparation, I think you'll be already starting to push your negotiation capabilities significantly further forward. One of the things we find, it's slightly anecdotal, but I'm convinced it's true because I've been there, is most people prepare for the negotiation in the car on the way to the meeting. Right? That's when it typically happens. And I'm as guilty as everybody else. What I want to say to you is if it's worth going to the negotiation and if the deal's worth doing, then it's got to be worth spending some more time preparing for it. And that's where, again, I'd like you to start to think about engaging with these elements. So the framework, when we sort of map it out, looks like this, okay? So we've got the 7 elements laid out in a certain way, and I'm going to take you through this kind of framework and why it's laid out like this, but this is how we see it. We see relationship and communication as kind of foundational elements that help tee us up to be in the best place possible for our negotiation. We then see interests, options, and legitimacy as the kind of core piece of the discussion that we want to get into. And again, I'll explain these one by one in a minute. Okay, so that's the kind of, and that circle that they sit in is called the circle of value. The reason it's called the circle of value is because when you're in the elements of interest, options, and legitimacy, you are typically adding value to a negotiation. You are putting value on the table, okay? You are discussing value. That's why those are important. So to be in that circle is a great place to be, but you need relationship and communication to help get you there. Equally, down at the bottom, we have alternatives and commitments, right? So alternatives, and again, we'll talk in a little bit more detail, but alternatives are things that aren't on the table. So they're not value adding, but they are tactics that you need to think about, and there might be strategies in there as well. Commitments are kind of when you're done, right? You're either done because you're going to do a deal, or you're done because you're not, right? And so again, they're not value adding as such. They are kind of closure elements, really. So that's how we kind of map them out in this particular framework, and you'll see this reflected in the kind of slides that are coming up. So it's about creating a place to work and a style that we work in. It's about getting into a creative space, coming up with lots of value options, and then it's about decision making, and that's kind of how we see those 7 elements played out. Okay, sorry, move my slides. There we go. Right, so let's just talk about these as we go and go through each one, and you'll see them mapped again on that framework slide to the left of the picture here. So relationships, we get hung up about relationships, as we said before. We get stuck in this balance between substance and relationship, and trying to be nice and trying to do all that stuff. And big companies, as we know, have huge budgets for entertainment, right? They still do all this stuff. Whilst a lot of it has been demonized and outlawed, there's still a huge amount of whining and dining that goes on because companies are trying to build relationships, right? It's tickets to Formula One, or it's all these types of things. It's dinners, it's that kind of stuff. But what we want to think about is relationships actually being simply the way in which parties interact before, during, and then ongoing after a negotiation. And we want to think about relationships as the ability to create an environment in which you can do business. And we don't really want to think about it much further than that. We don't want to overthink it. We don't want to build it into friendship or any of that stuff. We want relationship to be really about, how do I create an environment with this counterparty that enables us both to do good business together? And when you think about it like that, and if you think about your experiences, I'm sure you've got places where you've done probably some quite good deals with people you don't like, people you'd rather not spend any time with, and all of those types of things. But you've managed to create an environment where you've been able to do business. And that's really what we're talking here. Again, there's a couple of things about being soft on the people and hard on the issues. We never really want to get personal. I've got a client right now I'm going to talk to later on this afternoon. He's going to go into a negotiation with one of his customers. They've historically always squabbled like school children. And I literally have to coach this guy. He's a very senior commodities trader in the city, and he can never get away from personalities. He always goes after the person, and he doesn't focus on the issue. And what we want to do is say, it really doesn't matter. Personalities really at this level don't matter. What matters is that you stay focused on the substance of the deal, and you create an environment that you can do business together in. So that's really where we are with relationship. And then we'll talk about, oh, hang on, sorry, jumping too far. So again, soft on the people, hard on the issues, all right? We don't want to give concessions on substance. We always need to think about respect and courtesy, and I do some work with multicultural organizations where we think about cultural nuances, whether we're working with, I don't know, counterparties in Japan or certain places where culturally we need to be sensitive to behaviors. So we've got to have all of those types of understandings with us. And really what we're doing is trying to build trust. And again, trust doesn't mean that we are giving in anything, that we're declaring anything secretive, or we're being naive, but we do want to build an area of trust where we can do some good work in. Communication is the other foundational element. So I think you can probably understand now, having the right environment where you can work, clearly important. The right environment where you can do business with counterparties who you can build this trust with. So the next one's really about communication. And this is really anything that sends messages, actions, or signals that actually indicate, wittingly or unwittingly, what it is that you're wanting to do. Okay, so we need to think about communication because it's very easy to send messages that we don't intend to send. It's very difficult to communicate, particularly at the moment when face-to-face meetings probably aren't a reality. Procurement organizations for the last 20 years have dehumanized a lot of the communication, right? So I was in procurement at the outset of online auctions, reverse auctions, and all those types of things. And I don't know if some of you get caught up in some of those things, but one of the reasons that we justified reverse auctions with was it dehumanizes, it takes away the people from the negotiation. And at the time that felt like a great thing, because then of course you don't get any risk of personalities and friendships getting in the way of doing the deal. However, that makes it difficult, right? Because you can't talk about things like value. You can't talk about the ambiguities of the deals that you're trying to do. You can only talk about specifics and positions like price. So they're challenging. However, they're real and they exist, and you've got to deal with it. So thinking about how you behave in those things is also part of your communication strategy. As we say here, we want to balance advocacy and inquiry. And what does that mean? We want to make sure we've got the right mix of saying, here's how I see it, advocating, right? Here's how I see it. Here's what's important, I think, for us to agree. And you also want to, as I said at the top of the discussion when we were talking about pricing and knowing about appropriate pricing, is you want to ask some questions. So that's all about inquiry. And in a later webinar, we'll talk a lot more in detail about communication strategies. There's 4 elements to kind of really good communication strategy, and these are 2 of them. But you've got to get the balance right, right? So it isn't just about, most salespeople turn up and talk endlessly about how great their product is. And they do so without actually bothering to ask the customer what's important to them. And so we want to get that balance readdressed, and we want to get that balance right. Equally, I'm often guilty of actually spending too much time asking the customer things when I actually then don't spend enough time saying, well, here's how we can help, or here's what we do. So getting that balance right is ongoing and challenging. And you've also got to think about how you're interpreted. So you've got to think about what people hear versus what you have said. And those things are often very different things. So you've really got to manage your communication approach very, very closely. So here's just some guidelines on this. So really thinking about listening. So listening is a key skill here, right? Listening to make sure you understand what it is that's important to your counterparty. It doesn't mean you're agreeing. It means you're listening and understanding. And in all of our communication strategies, unless we do actually agree, all we're doing is acknowledging. And people need acknowledgement, right? So if you think about when you, I don't know, if any of you've got kids and you talk to them and they don't answer because they're sat looking at that flipping screen that you bought them foolishly for Christmas, you don't get acknowledgement, and it makes you feel pretty bad, right? Well, the same happens in business environments as well. So acknowledging is really important. Listen, demonstrate that you've heard, be confident that it's okay to do that, because acknowledgement isn't agreeing. It's just saying, yeah, I hear you. I understand what you're saying. Get that balance right between asking some questions to find out more and talking about what's important to you and what you can offer and what's good about you and your organization. And as I say to every client I've ever met, is just stay curious, right? Get curious, bring some curiosity in there. Don't interrogate. It's not an interview. It's an exercise in trying to understand and find out more. And when you think about it, if you go back to that haggling slide, one of the reasons haggling doesn't work is we never spent any time trying to understand what the client wants. We spend all our time telling them what we want them to hear. So we want to try and change that and use that curiosity to say, actually, I'm really interested in making sure that you, Mr. Client, get what you need from this discussion. But guess what? I need to do that too, and that's advocacy. So balancing those 2 things in an environment that's hopefully productive and allowing you to do that because there's enough trust in the room for you to do that, actually gets both parties to a position of understanding what it is that's important. And it sounds so obvious, but unless we spend time understanding what's important, how are we ever going to expect to get that thing delivered in a negotiation? So it's really, really critical that we think about our communication very, very in a lot of detail, particularly when we're locked away and we can't necessarily do things face to face. So as I said, foundational. So we've got relationship, we've got communication. Hopefully they're in the right space, and we're starting to then think about how do we add value to this discussion, and that's where we step into this circle. And the first one's interests. And interests can be quite difficult to understand. So interests are what motivate parties to negotiate together in the first place. They are the reason that you are in the room, and they are the reason that the other party is in the room as well. And the challenge with that, which is why it's so difficult for a lot of folks to understand, is we instantly go to positions. And positions aren't interests. So price, for example, is a position. It is not an interest. So when you get into a conversation with a client and they go, I need this for £100 a unit, that's not actually their interest. That's a position that they are taking to meet an interest which you have yet to uncover, which is why we talk about digging underneath positions to understand interests. And that's why we would then step back to our element of communication and go, if I was to use more inquiry and get curious about what is it about £100 a unit that's important to them, I might discover a whole load more things about what they're trying to achieve beyond just an absolute number that we're then going to get caught up in a haggling spiral on. So we've always got to dig under positions to understand interests. And it's a critical skill. And if I can work this thing, I think we've got a picture that kind of highlights it. Here we go. Sorry, consultant. I either bring a 4-box diagram or I bring an iceberg picture. I can't stop myself. So here we go, an iceberg picture. Positions, right? So like the tip of an iceberg. There are a specific way that we might satisfy an underlying objective. Okay, so what we want to think about much more is what is that underlying objective, and that's where we get into this concept of interests. 7 elements negotiation is often also referred to as interest-based negotiation, because what it does is it spends a huge amount of its time trying to understand underlying goals and needs that are driving parties to want to negotiate with each other in the first place. So for example, if I go back to that example of the cancer treatment that I'm helping a pharma company negotiate at the moment, the $300,000 number is a position. It's not an interest, right? The pharma company is interested in that because what are they driving? They're having to cover costs. They've got R&D, they've got innovation, they've got all of these things that they're thinking about, okay? They've also got a small population, they've got financial goals, all of these things. The payers, the people in the government are obviously going, well, £300,000, that's a challenge because of it's a lot of money. But actually, when you dig underneath that and go, well, what is it you're worried about? Very few of them say, I'm worried about £300,000, because actually governments have got hundreds of millions of pounds. What they're worried about is certainty of budget. So if you start to dig under the position with them, what we uncover is, well, but we need to know that there's a certainty of how much money we're spending, because actually as a government department, we've only got so much, it's finite. So then you can start to say, the thing we're doing then is trying to solve a problem of how we ensure you get budget certainty in the area of oncology if you were to use this drug as part of your treatment regime. Guess what? There's a load of ways I can help you make sure you have budget certainty without actually talking about changing the price. So this is why it's really important that we actually take positions. We understand when positions are in play, and 99% of the time it's going to be a price position. And then we use a communication to inquire, to get curious and really understand what's driving that number. With procurement people, you'll see it maybe materialize in terms of things like savings. I need 10% lower, or we've got to drive 30% out of the business. And what we want to do with that, because that's positional, is say, well, help me understand what 30% looks like. Help me understand what you're trying to achieve. Help me understand how that helps meet your business goals. And once you do that, you'll be able to then step into a world that we're going to talk about next of options, which is here's 1,000 ways I could help you deliver that objective without necessarily having to sit here and just haggle backwards and forwards and play price ping pong. So that's why interest is really important. And the biggest challenge always will be you will get stuck in positional bargaining because, as we said really early on in the presentation, it's hardwired into who we are. I think I've got, oh no, I haven't, hang on. There's a story about an orange. I thought I had a slide on it, but I don't. So let me tell you a story about an orange, okay? Because it highlights this pretty good. So, especially if you've got kids and you're in lockdown, right? And you're trying to work in your home office, which is probably your spare room or whatever it is. So it's not exactly great. And you've got 2 kids somewhere in the background screaming and fighting over something. And what they're fighting over is an orange, right? So you've got 1 orange left in the fruit bowl and they both want it. So they're screaming like crazy. You're trying to do a Zoom call with a load of clients. And of course, this isn't what you want in the background. So you go down there and of course, your first thing is to see these 2 children screaming and fighting over the 1 orange. So I can't get interactive on this one, but what I suspect most of us would do, I'd probably lock my kids in the garage, I've got to be honest. But if I didn't do that, I'd probably chop the orange in half and give them half each, right? Problem solved. However, if I stopped and asked them what they wanted, I might find out that one child wanted some orange juice and the other child wanted to use the zest of the orange to make a cake. And that's digging underneath positions to understand interests. And of course, if I did that, what I'd be able to do is satisfy 100% of both child's interests by just asking the question as to what they wanted from that orange. Whereas if I just cut it in half, I'm making an assumption and actually neither child really gets what they want. So again, we've really got to think about how we understand and dig beneath the things that are typically presented first, which is a positional play, and actually understand what's driving those positions. And that's where we get into this second element within this circle of value. It's called options. And actually, it's quite simple once you understand interests. So we now know why we're both in the room. We've probably shared our interests with our counterparty, maybe not naively. We don't want to share everything sort of straight away. We have to be clever in terms of how we think about sharing what's important to us. And we've used some inquiry to really start to understand what's important to them. And when we've been faced with positions, we've dug underneath those positions to really get to the root cause of what's driving those. Then actually we're into a really creative space of looking for options, okay? So again, a bit like my example with the governments and the pharmaceutical companies, if budget certainty is a problem for you, Mr. Government Man, here's some options about how a financially wealthy pharmaceutical company can maybe help with that. Maybe we cap the amount of money you spend with us in a given year. Maybe we think differently about payment terms and we can extend some of this into next year's budget cycle. These are ways that you could meet the interests of the counterparty that haven't meant that you've instantly gone to changing your price or reducing your price. So options are all those things that we can do to get to an agreement. It doesn't mean they are things that we will do, but the more that we can put on the table, actually the more chance we have of finding this mutual value creating space that means both parties get what they want without having to make unnecessary concessions. And as I said earlier on, making concessions isn't really what this is about. And there's a danger people see this when we talk about, use words like collaborative or mutually beneficial, that people think it's some kind of soft touch approach. It's actually exactly the opposite, because we don't want to make concessions at the table. We want to make sure that our counterparts are getting everything they want, and we want to make sure we're getting everything we want as well. And that's actually genuinely very difficult to do. Options then, everything we can do together to make to meet interests. Okay. And I just wanted to share, I'll build this slide. I did promise a 4-box diagram. I think this is a double axis one, so I'm kind of fulfilling my consulting requirements here, I think, pretty well. Pareto, Italian economist, did this kind of stuff, right? So why is this important here? So what we often find when we're thinking about options is that we don't think broadly enough. We don't think deeply enough. And so where we might end up with is something like that, that little X there in the center, where we've kind of got that purple circle with the X in it. And the reason we often find options that sit around about there is very simple. Is because actually, if you look at the two axes, value to customer and value to supplier, our kind of human intuition tells us that the options need to be the same for both parties. So the value needs to be the same because that feels fair, right? So fairness is really important. And again, in a later webinar, we'll talk a lot about the need for fairness in human beings because it's actually hardwired into who we are. So we typically, when we go into the element of options, is we come up with lots of ideas, but they actually sit somewhere around that where that X is. And that's not a bad thing. But actually, it means that what you're missing is a whole load of wasted value. So if you look in that green sort of sector there, there's loads of deals and ideas and options in there that we would never entertain. And the reason we wouldn't entertain them is because they're heavily skewed to one side or the other. So our mind tells us that actually anything in that green quadrant, if I don't know, let's suppose I'm the supplier, there's some dots in there that show a huge amount of extra value for the customer, but not so much extra value for me. So I'm reluctant to go there. So I don't put them on the table because it doesn't feel equitable or fair. However, if you take your emotional brain and switch it off for a minute and put your logical brain on, what you actually quickly find is, as long as there's more value than I would have got from the other option, it's actually insanity not to go for them and not to put them on the table. And I need to break the cycle of worrying that all my agreements have to have the same amount of value for both parties. As long as there's more value for me than I am getting, it's logical for me to say I should go for that. If there's exponentially more value for my counterparty, well, hey, that's just great for them, and that just shows that I'm the sort of person that brings value to the table. I shouldn't be sat thinking that I deserve some of that and we should in some way equally split that value. So we often don't go into that, and there's a zone of kind of lost agreement that sits in that green quadrant, and because we literally don't go there because we feel that they're not fair to both parties. The other determinant very quickly there is actually around time. So to create a lot of options needs a lot of time, needs a lot of engagement with the client, and it's unrealistic to assume you will have a lot of time to do all of these things. So sometimes we don't get as far along these options generation tasks as we'd like to, because we just simply don't have enough time, and that's just life, I'm afraid. Hopefully that's useful. I'm going to stop for a minute because I just need to slurp some coffee into my head and get some caffeine going. Any questions? I can see, Mrinal, are you asking a question about examples? Anyone else want to ask a quick question before we move on?
Okay, I'll let you slurp some coffee, get some coffee in your head.
Thanks.
Manal, did you have a question there?
I mean, this is a great diagram. I think I understand it, but can you just give an example, please?
Yeah, he said courageously. I can give examples of where I've been in this space. So, you know, so as I said before, I worked at DHL for a while, and obviously doing a lot of deals on transportation, on warehousing, and a lot of those were open book deals, but some of them weren't. And where they were closed book deals, DHL is quite an aggressive company, actually. And in Southeast Asia, where I was based for a long time, DHL were able to get, you know, warehousing and space and facilities for clients at some pretty advantageous rates. So the value to them as a supplier could often be very high, depending on some of the options that were created. And quite often, the clients who were taking advantage of that were also getting value, but not as much. And it used to create a huge amount of I guess, discord, because clients would literally be thinking DHL don't share the value they've got from being able to buy in the way they can, being able to lease millions of square feet of warehousing space across some of these countries. And it would create a lot of disruption. So sort of coming from the customer perspective, they weren't willing to consider a lot of the options in there because they perceived that the value to DHL was way too high. And so they'd either refuse to do it, or they try and push DHL into some kind of, you know, profit share type agreement where some of that value got shared. And they're not necessarily bad things, but what it demonstrates is actually the behavior at the table says the value we create has to be equal or slightly skewed to the customer, not the supplier. So that you sort of see it materializing like that. But actually, when I think about this now, it's much more in the kind of, when I'm at the table with a counterparty and we're trying to get into a creative options generating space, what is preventing us having more options on the table? And what is preventing us is often this sense that everything has to be equal. And if you start to think about all the options you could have that are equal, they're actually quite limited. And they're typically limited down at the lower value range rather than the higher value range. Does that help?
I think so, yeah. I mean, as we organize events for clients, and one of the things I say is, if you sponsor an event throughout the rest of the year, we will try and make introductions for you, because that's us adding more value. And it's longer than the actual event. And I think that's something that we can give and that they want. And whether we get something back of it, I don't look at it as I need an immediate payout, because I think the longevity of keeping that client is much more valuable. So is that,
Yeah.
is that an example of what you're talking about?
Well, it can be, because, for example, I know people who will only do introductions if they get a commission, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I typically don't look for commission on introductions, because I introduce people and I think it's part of what I do. I think it's some value that I offer out into, you know, a broader client base. But some people don't think like that, which is exactly the point of saying the reason they need a commission is because, well, you've got something, so I have to have something too. And that's not always the case. But it means for those people who think like that, entertaining ideas in that green quadrant, very difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on, conscious a little bit of time and my inability to keep us on track. So let's talk about legitimacy. So the third option in the circle of value, okay, legitimacy. This is all about fairness. So it's the extent to which things in our agreement, the options that we put on the table, the things that we finally agree to are fair, okay? Fairness, basic human principle, has to happen. The reason I'm coaching this client this afternoon who's got this big call coming up with one of those customers is because he believes he was treated unfairly by that customer 5 years ago, and he's not forgotten it. So he can't stop. Every time he talks to them, he wants to have a go at them for the unfair treatment he thinks he got 5 years ago. And one of the big elements of fairness, for example, is reciprocity, right? So this idea that what happens to you happens to me, you know, do as you would be done by, all that kind of language, right? And it's hardwired into us as people. So this client about 5 years ago was asked by his customer to help them out financially. And I think they helped them out financially to the tune of about $5 million, right? Well, then 2 years later, my client was, their business was in equal financial difficulty. So they asked the customer to reciprocate and help them. And guess what? The customer said no, right? So that's the little bit of fairness that's just got lost within my client. So he can't forget it. So it's built into all of us. So it's important in all the deals we do, we think about how do we make them legitimate? What things can we refer to and demonstrate and show, make what we're proposing and what we want to agree to fair? And equally, what makes what you're asking of me unfair, if that's what you think, right? So it's what we call a sword and a shield. We use it to defend ourselves, to say, here's why this thing you're asking of me is unfair. Or we use it to support our proposal. Here's why what I'm suggesting is fair, right? So the question earlier about, is my price too low? I might have priced it very low. Well, you've got to legitimize why it is like that, right? Obviously, typically we'd expect people to say in the opposite, but I recognize that situation. And what you've really got to then do is build up facts, data, independent reference points that you can use in transparency to say, here's why this pricing point that I'm proposing for you is fair and equitable for the relationship and the deal that we're trying to do. So legitimacy are all those things that you can point to. In the pharmaceutical industry, as I've referred to, that I work to, it's things like clinical data, or it's you know, reports about patient responses to certain medicines. It's all that. It's healthcare economics. They're all sources of legitimacy that help demonstrate why what we're asking for is fair, or to help us defend ourselves when something is asked of us that we think is unfair. Okay, so that's legitimacy. It's about making sure we're behaving fairly, and we're using fairness as one of the key metrics for whether or not we can move forward and make an agreement together. I'll come back to the circle of value in a second. I just want to touch on the last two things here around alternatives and commitments. So alternatives are all the ways that we can meet our interests without actually having to do a deal with the counterparty, right? And equally, our counterparty has alternatives too, all the things they could do to meet their interests without doing a deal with you. In the English language, alternatives and options mean virtually the same thing. In negotiation strategy, they mean quite different things. So options are all the things that are on the table that you two parties could agree to together. They are options. Alternatives are all the things you could do that doesn't require the other party to agree to them. So for example, you could walk away, right? Walk away from the table. You don't need them to agree to that. You can just get up and do it, right? And if it's appropriate, and if it's better than what's on the table, you should absolutely walk away. We call that our BATNA, by the way. Our BATNA, our best alternative to a negotiated agreement, says to us is if there's something better than what we're now negotiating for, I should just walk away and go and do the better thing. That's just logic, right? Don't bluff that one, by the way. Don't threaten to walk away and then don't, because that maybe works once, but never more than that. So alternatives are important because they allow us that flexibility to step away and to go and find a deal that's actually more valuable than the one we might be stuck trying to negotiate for. A lot of salespeople think they don't have alternatives because, as I said earlier, they might be in structures where they're told you've got to win this deal, right? If you've got to win this deal, what you're actually saying is we're going to take away your alternative. And that's actually extremely limiting in your ability to do good deals. Equally, your counterparty has these BATNAs as well. Your counterparty has something that they could look at that doesn't mean they do a deal with you. Your job is to understand what that is. And your job is to make that look as less interesting, less exciting as you can, whilst at the same time making your alternative look as exciting and as promising as you can. And we don't want to get into the worlds of creating myths and lying and doing all that kind of stuff. But where we feel we need to talk about our alternatives, we need to make them look strong and credible. And you need to do your homework and make sure that they are strong and credible and you know what they are. Equally, if your counterparty throws an alternative play at you and says, you know what, this other supplier's got this much better deal, you want to know enough about that to be able to say, yeah, but you know what? Here's why we think dealing with us would actually have more value to them. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we do that in a second. But alternatives then subtly different from options because they're all the things you can do without having to agree, the other party needing to agree. The best of all your alternatives is called your BATNA, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And then the last one we'll touch on right now is commitments, right? So commitments are all the things, the statements you make, the things you write down, the contracts you sign that say what you will and won't do. One of the things that procurement people do a lot is try and cherry pick on commitments, right? So they try and make sure that they might say something like, let's agree the price today and we'll worry about everything else tomorrow. And what we want to do is to say, no, actually nothing's, and I'm going to sound like Theresa May at the Brexit negotiations here, I apologize. Nothing's agreed until it's all agreed. By the way, she was advised by some of our colleagues, but didn't take much of the advice, but she remembered some of the jargon. So nothing's agreed until it's all agreed means that we don't commit to anything, any part of the deal until we can see all of the deal, because you know what's going to happen, right? So you're going to agree to a price today, and then tomorrow when they ask you about terms and conditions, there's going to be stuff in there that you can't do for the price that you've just agreed to. So we want to make sure that we see the full value, the full implications of the deal before we make any commitments. We want to push back on cherry picking and saying, I hear that's important to you to agree to that quickly. However, I need to make sure I can see the whole value before we can make a full commitment. So you can acknowledge, say that you've heard and you've understood what they want without agreeing to make a commitment to it. So that's really important. And what we also want to think about is when you do make commitments, commit to process. So oftentimes in your negotiation build-up and your practice, rehearsal, is what you want to do is to say, how do we get to a situation where we can agree to the process that we're going to negotiate under, not the substance of it yet, right? So one of the reasons negotiations often fail is that both parties come at it with their own process and their own way of thinking they're going to deal with this. And what we think is quite useful is to actually get out in front of that and say, here's how we want to come to the table. We want to think a lot more about what's important to you. We want to make sure that we've got some great ideas and options that actually help you deliver against those goals that are important. And guess what? We've got some too, right? And it's important for us as a business and a credible business to have some of these objectives on the table and some of these things that we need to achieve. And if we do it in this way, perhaps we can both, work out something that's got a huge amount of value for both parties and even uncover more value than we even know exists right now. We want to do those types of things quite early because it builds the foundations to have those productive and credible discussions. And I'm very conscious as I say that's really easy in my office to say that. It's really hard to get it done in reality, okay? But agreeing on process early would be the one commitment we would want to make. And everything else we'd say we have to wait until we can see the full value of the deal. Okay, and I said talk to this slide earlier. So I'll close the 7 elements piece on this because I think it kind of says it all pretty well, all right? So there's no agreement, right? So this starts by saying there's no agreement. There's no deal unless or you get an agreement that is better than your alternatives. So it has to be better than something you could do elsewhere, or there is no point doing it. It has to meet your interests, not your positions, your interests very well. The interests of your counterparties, at least acceptably. And sometimes there are other parties who live with the consequences of your deal. Well, you want it to make sure it meets their interests as well. And you often see that where you're working maybe with government contracts, and there are other sort of or complex organizations where there are other divisions that might be involved. You want to make sure it's among many of the many options. So you've looked for all that wasted value in that green sector, and you want to make sure that it's legitimate. So no one feels cheated or taken, because everything that you're talking about has got standards of fairness, standards of legitimacy set against it. And you want to make sure that the commitments you make are planned and realistic, and you can actually execute on them in full and over time. And clearly we'd like that to be a process of good communication, and where you've built the kind of relationship that you want to maintain with that particular counterparty. So for us, that's a good success definition for a good negotiation. I'm going to stop. We've got a few minutes before we have to close, and I do just want to touch on a couple of procurement things. But any questions before we move on? Barbara, sorry, I'm running a bit tight.
Yeah, I was going to say we are running a little bit tight, but I think it would be useful to have questions. I can see people really focus, take notes and everything else. So I do think
let's do this, Barbara.
We could go on for probably 5 minutes extra.
Yeah, let's do this, and let's take questions and answers on this bit, and then maybe let's bring some of the other details into the next webinar we run. Yeah. Okay.
You know, when you're, it's Saad.
Hi.
Hi there. You know, when you're doing and dealing and you spend months negotiating with procurement in a different country, and suddenly the clients or I mean, we are in advertising. Suddenly the team takes over, and everything is changed. And as you go along, you don't even have time to write the SOW. It changed so much, and it changes on every other week. You know, and I don't want to talk about Corona, because, you know, we have seen plans shift, you know, 180 degrees over 3 days. So that's fine. How would you deal with that? I mean, our approach is be as useful, as helpful as you can, and develop a relationship with the client with a medium to long term in mind.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And we are in challenged times, and I've written and spoken at many things over the last couple of months about, I think the relationships that win in times like this are those that have that flexibility in them, right? So what I wouldn't want you to do is have to make concessions because your client's all over the place, because guess what? So are you, right? And as I was advising a client who's doing a deal with a company in Brazil right now who've called force majeure on them. Like, well, that's fine, legitimate to do that. However, COVID is affecting both sides of the negotiation table, right? So you need to get that balance and maintain that balance, that you're not responsible for these problems, and you're dealing with them too, and so is your business. And that speaks to me in the communication relationship space of saying, we're happy and comfortable to continue to be flexible and agile to work with you. Here are perhaps some of the constraints that make that challenging, and perhaps that can come on the table. But I think the ones that work over time, and particularly through challenges like this, are those ones that can demonstrate that relationship as being flexible, agile, pragmatic, but actually not one where, oh my God, my client's struggling, I'm going to make concessions, because I suspect you're struggling too, right? And it's legitimate and fair for you to ask for that flexibility as much as they ask it of you.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. The other question I wanted to ask about, which I've been involved in the past with government contracts, which is the reverse auction.
Oh, yeah.
It's very difficult to talk about value when everything is about price. And when it comes to price, then all the human element will be out of the window. And it's all about, because the government procurement buys, I don't know, screws and bolts for submarines in Scotland and whatever, and they think we buy them all the same. Creative services, consultancy, whatever. And so they have this crude approach sometimes. And it's all a machine, and whoever is outbid the other goes above the red line and so on. It's a difficult one.
It's really difficult. So as a procurement person in my earlier days, we were taught to commoditize everything, right? So the more I can make everything look the same, the more I can say to all of you, right, this is a commodity market, therefore price is key, right? That's how commodity markets work. So part of your challenge is to decommoditize yourself, if that's possible. The other trick, though, with reverse auctions, and there's a lot of psychology around reverse auctions. So they run on two things, right? They run on competitiveness and they run on time. And they constantly push those two levers. Oh my God, my counterparties are bidding, and actually the clock's ticking down and I'm going to run out of time. And what you always see in reverse auctions typically see in reverse auctions is a trend. And the trend starts somewhere up here, in the early part of the auction where everyone's putting in some initial prices. And it stays like that for a little while. And then somebody breaks ranks and it starts to fall. And then once one goes, everybody goes. Then it starts to level off a little bit as the clock's getting closer to an end. And then somebody typically goes super low, or someone might go, shit, excuse my language, damn, I've gone too low, and they go back up again. The original intent of reverse auctions and the first company to market was called free markets. And the reason it was called free markets is what you're actually trying to do as a procurement person is understand where the market is, not the absolute price. So the first thing to remember is, whilst they might have forgotten this, what this technology shows them is where the market is, which is somewhere off the bottom of that curve, right? On the assumption that half a dozen companies bidding aren't all going to put prices in that they can't sustain. That tells you that that's the market. And if my advice to you would be, if you're in that space, that's fine. Don't try and be the lowest, right? And unless you can afford to be. If you can price lower, then obviously, and you want to, then obviously do that. But don't feel that you have to just because they're playing competition and time against you. Because what we often used to find with these things is someone would go super low. We'd obviously go, oh, we'll buy from there. And literally 6 months later, they'd be going, that price, sorry, we need to come back and ask for an increase, right?
That's right.
So you've got to manage the psychology of what is it they're trying to achieve. You've got to be super clear on what price you can genuinely afford and you genuinely want to bid at, and do not get into the trap of thinking, oh God, the clock's ticking, I need to go low, unless you can.
But at that time, you don't have time for rationale. And
that's why your preparation is absolutely everything. And then that's why you've also got to think about relationship. I did one of these when I was at DHL for Apple. And we did the reverse auction for some transportation for Apple. And then when we'd finished, and I think we came down somewhere in that bottom kind of quadrant, so within the market, the phone rang and it was the guy at Apple saying, right, now what's your real price? And I'm like, okay, that kind of was my real price. And if I'd spent more time on a relationship, I'd understood that that's how Apple play the game, right? And I could have then said, either we're not playing that game, so if that's what you want to do, we're not doing it. Or I would have priced differently, so I could have had that further discussion with them. And that's about understanding how your counterparty works.
And do you discuss that early on? What if they introduce it after all the PQQs and whatever, and suddenly they say, we're doing this, you have the opportunity to pull out, basically?
Well, my view is if they've asked you to put your best pricing into an online auction tool and you've got another price that's better than that, you've not been fair and honest, and neither have they, right? So my advice would say, make sure you know what your best, fairest price is and stick to it, and then use legitimacy to justify why it's fair.
Okay. Yeah.
And even I'd use legitimacy to say, it's unfair of you, Mr. Client, to ask us to put our best price in and then call us again and ask for an even better one because you're assuming we've not done something fairly already. That feels uncomfortable to me, and that's fair and legitimate for you to say that.
I'm sorry to butt in, Saad.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Starting to get people in the chat saying they do
No
have
problem.
to go.
Yeah.
Because
Okay.
I think in this world that we're in, people do have a lot of calls lined up. It's a really, really good discussion. So I don't want people to lose any of those points. So if you want to share with us those questions, then maybe, David, we could pick those up at the start.
Happy to. And the material we didn't get to today, I promise you will be in the next one that we schedule.
Yeah. So you can see why we've split this up, because there is a lot of information and very useful information in this. We want to give time for questions as well. So please be here for the next one, which is next week, the 14th, at the same time. We will send out reminders so that you know how to access the webinar. But other than that, David, any last words from you?
No, just thank you. And I'm so sorry. I can see the chat group with lots of questions. Sorry we couldn't get to all of them. I'm happy that you email me or reach out to me directly. That's fine. Always happy to take any questions you might have offline, as well as obviously hopefully see you at the next one.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you.
So thank you all ever so much for that. You were great, and I will see you at the next one.
Thank you.
Much.
Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.